This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 354, and it is September the 15th, 1978. For those of you that subscribe regularly to these tapes, I will be giving them a date and just one number instead of numbering on both sides and giving it a different number from now on. Tape last week was 353 on both sides, and we go to 354, and it's just a little technicality, but we'll give one number for each tape, and you can refer to side 1 and 2. There are many quotations to the effect that if we don't study the history, we're likely to repeat this. Santa Anna's quotation is the most often used, and I don't like to use it verbatim because it just seems to roll off our tongues like the Pledge of Allegiance without really saying it differently each time with the same intent. That those who do not study the past are really jeopardized into understanding their own times, because our own times are a succession of what preceded us, and our future is no better than what we do with it today based upon our experiences of the past. One of the finest books about the past available is a book called Inspection for Disarmament by Seymour Melman. Inspection for Disarmament was published in 1958 by Columbia University Press, and the chapter that is particularly important in that book is by E.J. Gumbel, a professor from Heidelberg University who had been fired by Adolf Hitler. He was written up in Time magazine just prior to the election of Adolf Hitler in 1933, and that he had made a remark in the university putting down the erecting of monuments of war heroes. He didn't give much credence to warriors, and he was fired from the university, and I guess left Europe and came to the United States. And in this book, the essay by E.J. Gumbel, they repeated the research that he did on what were 400 assassinations of foes of Adolf Hitler and the National Christian Party that preceded Adolf Hitler coming into power. And in conjunction with the political assassinations, I quote from the book because it's so terribly important to Evelle Younger and the House Select Committee and the courts, the Warren Commission courts, and what has happened in the United States, whether it's the Kent State or the Manson trial or the SLA case, the role of the law courts. This is a quotation from the book, and it says, "The role of the law courts made all of these political assassinations possible. The political assassinations were committed by secret armies who put a heavy burden on the administration of justice. The murderers had to be acquitted, or later in our case they were killed or became patsies, and the victims had to be shown as guilty." And I refer to people such as Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, Sirhan. In quotes, "The military courts were set up which sided with the military men." In this case, I give the example of William Blakey, who tells the House Select Committee on television, "We have objective witnesses," and then when they're through, they thank the Army for their leaves. A Dr. Vincent Gwynn is described in the newspaper, the recent meetings of the House Select Committee, as a, quotes, "a professor from Irvine College," yet he testified that he was from NASA and atomic energy. In Germany, the military took care of the courts, the defense lawyers, and also the trial judges. Mr. Gumbel said, in quotes, "There was no proof of illegal activities that was allowed to be admitted into the court. No proof of the illegal activity was admitted in courts, and by this procedure the Supreme Court could affirm that there were no conspiracies and they didn't exist. And in order to assure sentences, officers of the military government were called as the witnesses for the prosecution." Mr. Gumbel said the courts were manipulated by the inability to find the guilty and by issuing false papers of identity by the police department for these various people. This reminds me of when James Earl Ray left the prison. The warden didn't give any alert that he had gone for 24 hours. When they were looking for an Eric Gold, the former prison officials and the police in Memphis, Tennessee, didn't have the fingerprints of James Earl Ray. They'd given the wrong fingerprints. Meanwhile, he had left prison with the false identity papers of a Mr. Raines. And then, of course, he had a car and license and identity of Eric Starbo Galt and Mr. Bridgman and Mr. Sneed and a lot of other people. He had these false identities. So this was the way the courts were manipulated in Nazi Germany. And if you study that and you study Mr. Gumbel's essay and research on that period, you can transpose it to what's happening in the United States. And it was only after I began to study the courts in the United States, the Warren Commission and the assassination of Robert Kennedy and the various Martin Luther King, the various violences, particularly in California, that it became necessary to go further to study history because none of this was making any sense. There is a book that I bought several years ago, published. It's the title of the book is Anti-California, Report from Our First Para-Fascist State by Kenneth Lamott, Lamott. And I'm just going to give you the references on the printed sheet if you want to get access to this book. It first came out in 1963, and this was before the fascism was really coming down in this state. And in succeeding years, it's been republished. The last date on it is 1971. It was published by Little Brown and Company, Anti-California, Report from Our First Para-Fascist State. And what the introduction to this book explains, and I'm going to just read you a few pages because if you're interested, you can look it up. He said, I tried earnestly to avoid using the word fascism in the title of this book. It's an emotional word, an inflammatory word. Fascism is an irreplaceable word conveying a sense of the methodical corruption of public life as well as the destruction of private lives. Yet there is clearly a difference of kind and of degree between Germany in 1930 and 40 and California in 1960 and 70. We look around for stormtroopers. Instead, we see Hell's Angels and Birchers and hard hats. We wait for Mussolini and Hitler, and we get Ronald Reagan. Fascism to California is coming at all levels, and while the Birchers are not enforcing Nuremberg laws and the Hells Angels are not operating death camps, yet, he says, there is something not entirely unfamiliar about what is going on in the United States and what is going on in California. California is the distant warning system for the rest of the United States. California is our window to the future. California is the center of the whirlpool where all the currents come to focus. Reports from California are the minutes of the next meeting. And what you see here is the disintegration of a state, the corruption of a promised land, what should have been the brightest and the best. According to Kenneth Lamott, he said California is governed by charismatic buffoons who are not reluctant to use their tremendous power. 1/3 of the people depend upon the daily bread for the production of bombs, missiles, napalms, and every other obscene item found in the modern catalog of death. In California, war is literally the health of the state. We are engaged in open warfare against an eternal enemy who is often described in terms that would have instructed Goebbels. And the enemy, of course, is our own young people. Our universities and colleges are being manipulated. Technology has triumphed. It is the index of private distress, suicide, drugs, alcohol, meaningless sexual activity. It is a racist state with deliberate subjugation of native Indians, the Chicanos, the Mexican Americans. There is moral apathy in California, and this I can guarantee. There is moral apathy. He goes into the Chicanos, who more than a century have been California's largest suppressed minority, are finally becoming visible thanks to Cesar Chavez. In the case of the blacks, because of tragedies and riots and the murder of Ruben Salazar by the Los Angeles Police Department, he says the spokesmen also here are being eliminated. This book goes into some of the fascists of California. He names a few of them from Berkeley and throughout the state, and it gives you a background of what this man fears and the comparison of what he sees coming as towards Nazi Germany. Now, this tape is not just a tirade against Evelle Younger. It is particularly against Younger. But I have no love for the position of our Governor Brown, and I want you to know in an election year what I feel about Governor Brown. I don't know how much he's controlled by his father. Jerry Brown was put in as a Democratic candidate. His father was a governor before. He lost the election to Ronald Reagan. He has a law office in Beverly Hills. A member of his law office is Joseph Ball of the Warren Commission. He was John Ehrlichman's attorney at the time of Watergate for burglarizing Dr. Lewis Fielding's offices in Beverly Hills. Joseph Ball and any member of the Warren Commission belongs to what I call the killer team. If they didn't plan the killings, they covered them up, and he is in the law office of the former Governor Brown. Another member to join that law office just last week is Herbert Kalmbach, another member of the killer team, lawyer for United Airlines, who covered up that fatal plane crash of Dorothy Hunt, the Watergate bag woman carrying money at the time that they were trying to hide Herbert Kalmbach's connections to the secret funding. He took Martha Mitchell to a hospital using a name as if she was his wife, didn't give them her name. She was injected, died 3 years later of cancer, was kept a prisoner. Herbert Kalmbach was part of the inner secret team of clandestine activities, along with the Martha Mitchell fatal death and Dorothy Hunt's fatal, all deaths are fatal, but I mean the manipulation of these women and the role that Herbert Kalmbach had in the inner secret monies. He ends up in the law offices of the father of our governor. Now, that doesn't mean to cast aspersions on Jerry Brown necessarily. I have a father who's politically conservative and a friend of Richard Nixon's and a lot of the extreme right wing, close with Evelle Younger, Ed Davis, and the whole gang. That doesn't mean that I think like him. I think differently. I am not controlled by his ideas. I am free thinking. The only thing I know is that when Governor Brown became the governor, he took Raymond Precunier, who was the chief of the prison system, who started the riots and worked with the LAPD, started the riots in the sense that there was hard evidence that the gun that was brought in that killed George Jackson and that painful San Quentin 6 trial was instigated by the Los Angeles Police Department criminal conspiracy section set up by Evelle Younger. Raymond Precunier was in on the murder of the black prisoners in Soledad, the shootout of Jonathan Jackson, and Raymond Precunier should have been removed from any office, and yet Governor Brown took him under his wing and gave him a very important job, even though the bulk of the violence at the California prisons was set up by Raymond Precunier. So the office of Jerry Brown's father is tainted with Joseph Ball and now Herbert Kalmbach, a Republican of the first order with money for Richard Nixon and company, now working in this Democratic office, which reminds me of the switch of John Connally to the Republican Party, from the Democrats to the Republicans. And all I say is I don't know what taint they have on Jerry Brown, except that Jerry Brown on his own has people like Raymond Precunier working for him, where the past efforts that this man has, he should have been removed from office. So even at best, he hires people that are not great. Now, this tape isn't about Jerry Brown. It's about Evelle Younger. So, but I do want to tell you that it isn't clear-cut on either side. I don't think we have elections with choices. There's so much alike that I think you vote for the lesser of two evils. And in this case, I really can't think of anything more evil in operation, in links to the Central Intelligence Agency, to the Pentagon. He's a current general at this time, and was a district attorney in Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and now wants to be the governor. And because this state has all the earmarks of everything but the goose steps, I do want to devote the time to Evelle Younger and the reasons why I fear this man and why it should be a sensational story for any single thing that he's done, and yet the entire state just sleeps on it as if he were a little pussycat and a mild little man that nobody knows anything about. It's hard to put into any chronological order what's wrong with Evelle Younger in my mind, because you could just take, I have maybe 80 articles here and 80 things that he's involved in, enough to have written a book about him, I suppose, or maybe I still could. But there's no chronological order in my feelings towards him or what I'm going to tell you. I'll just take what I have here and as much as we have time for. The first time I ever really became familiar with his name as being of interest to me, because I'd been studying the John Kennedy assassination for 4 years, was in the time that Robert Kennedy was killed and Evelle Younger was going to investigate the Robert Kennedy assassinations. In July of 1968, Robert Kennedy was killed in June. Evelle Younger had a large article in the Los Angeles Times, July 14th, 1968. It's a collector's item for those of you that want it. It said 23-man task force selected to probe Kennedy's murder. A select team of Los Angeles policemen, each handpicked for his specialty skills, will go into the murder of Robert Kennedy. A 23 task force headed by Captain Hugh Brown, a police homicide, will do the investigative work. The boss is Younger's top aide, Chief Deputy District Attorney Lynn J. Compton, one-time UCLA football hero and a conscientious prosecutor, and no stones would be left unturned by U.S. Attorney Matt Byrne and Deputy Police Chief Robert Houghton. They would draw from all their resources into the fatal murder of Robert Kennedy. And Younger said, in quotes, "No lead, no piece of evidence, no matter how kooky, will be overlooked. If there are 10,000 leads, and we checked out 9,999 and let another one go, someone would write a book accusing us of covering up something. Unimportant leads that might be ignored in cases otherwise checked. So we don't want another New Orleans District Attorney, Jim Garrison, that type of person, to come in 4 years later and say, we didn't do this and we didn't do that, and we are aware that the whole nation, the whole world is watching." So I wrote a letter July in 1968. I had written to Evelle Younger in the office, "Dear Mr. Younger, I had stated I have done research on the Kennedy assassination for 4 years. I've contacted Sergeant Paget and Sergeant Collins, and I would like to come down and give information to them about the links of the Sirhan family into the CIA, and you've said that you'll see everybody, and I want to come to your office and give you the information about the investigation that you're going to be doing." I got a telephone call back July 26, 1968, Friday at 1:40 p.m. from a Sergeant Miller. And he said, "Are you Magnan Brussell?" My name was Mae Brussell, and they had my middle name there. They said, "Would you give us your height? How much do you weigh? What color is your hair? And what is your nationality?" And that is the last I ever heard of the investigators of the Robert Kennedy assassination. The entire state of California has been one scene of violence and murders against witnesses and crimes. I just can't emphasize enough, so much like Nazi Germany, that I'll just give you a few examples. In the newspapers in February of 1972, there were articles by Frank Martinez, a man that worked for alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, that the Sheriff Peter Pitches and the Los Angeles Police Department were out against the Mexican Americans. I have an article, Los Angeles Police versus Mexican Americans. And they charge in quotes that there was a police state. At that time, a David Aguayo, 16 years old, had been hit in the head. But there was the Chicano moratorium with shootouts by the police into the crowd. That's when Ruben Salazar was murdered, the newspaper man who had come home from Vietnam. There were charges of the law enforcement when Evelle Younger was the district attorney down there of this violence in the Los Angeles area. Now, an assemblyman in Sacramento started to look into these matters. His name is Robert Crown. He represented Alameda County, a member of the California Assembly. And the articles I have in 1972 is that he was looking into the police brutality and the charges of a police state down in the Southern California area. Robert Crown was very important because he was on the Criminal Justice Committee, also in Sacramento, and had the deciding vote on the death penalty. Evelle Younger was pushing the death penalty, was and is, and the people that he would kill, that he had on his list were Sirhan and Charles Manson, and I felt that they should be preserved. First of all, I don't believe in the death penalty, but all victims of political assassinations, of killing political persons, should be preserved and deprogrammed by a series of doctors and not killed, because as soon as you kill them, you lose the chain of command. If there's a political assassination that changes the entire political structure in Saudi Arabia, the nephew has his head cut off the next day. That's one sure way of not knowing whether, in fact, the acid he got in Berkeley caused him to kill his uncle or not, or whether the oil prices increased the day after this kid's head was cut off, and the profits went into the Saudi Arabian oil very quickly. Robert Crown was looking into the matters of the charges of police state. He was run over by a car. He was jogging up in his hometown. For all purposes, I never could get a police report on who ran over him or that anyone was charged or fined. And his crucial vote was then delayed on the death penalty issue, and his work, of course, on the police state charges in Los Angeles never came to any results. Another person that worked down in the Los Angeles Police Department who was important to the murders of blacks and Mexican Americans or public official cover-ups was a coroner by the name of Donald Angus Stewart, S-T-U-A-R-T. And you can get the Los Angeles Times, April 14th, 1971. Coroner Stewart came in and he said that he was a doctor. He'd come from Canada and the Midwest. I have a list of all the various places he came from. And every time these blacks and Chicanos were dying, it was called justifiable homicide. And Thomas Noguchi, the coroner there, challenged Dr. Stewart. And one of the things that Dr. Stewart had done as deputy coroner was try to get Thomas Noguchi fired. Some of you don't remember this story. He was the coroner who said that the shot that killed Robert Kennedy, the fatal shot, was 1 inch behind the head. The burns and the direction of the shot was a downward up in the autopsy, 1 inch from the head. And of course, Sirhan was in front of Robert Kennedy and not behind him, and never had a gun 1 inch from his head. But a gentleman from Lockheed named Thane Cesar did have a gun, and he did fall to the floor, and he admitted he fired the gun, and he was the security guard right behind Robert Kennedy, and the autopsy of Thomas Noguchi would negate the findings that the official police report of Evelle Younger had on the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So the result was that they tried very hard to fire Thomas Noguchi, and they had a long list of charges made up by this wonderful Donald Angus Stewart. Noguchi fought those charges one by one and stayed in. And then 3 years later, he found out that Dr. Stewart was not a doctor, that he had falsified his claims. He obviously came from a CIA agency or trained by the Defense Intelligence Agency to come in as a doctor into a coroner's office and allow these murders to be slipped by on paper as all justifiable until there were screams in the coroner's office and the police department to investigate the police and Sheriff Peter Pitches. And one of the men who let Coroner Donald Angus Stewart off, this is what he got. He let all these murders go by and tried to get Thomas Noguchi fired, and his penalty was that he was out on probation and fined only $300. And what the statement was that he's out because there's no evidence that any harm was done. That is the most gross kind of court system down there, because the harm was done, that outright cold-blooded murders were done by law enforcement and were concealed. And this is, again, the comparison to Nazi Germany, where the military bring in their witnesses and judges. Now, the same U.S. Attorney Robert Meyer that let Donald Stewart off the hook got his in return. Later, he was investigating one of those exact murders that the Chicano group were claiming was a cold-blooded murder, Ruben Salazar. And he was also investigating, as U.S. Attorney, the Isla Vista riots, because they seemed to be a agent provocateur riot, the same kind we got with Hitler's Reichstag, to blame the students in Santa Barbara during the anti-war movement. And U.S. Attorney Robert Meyer got a telephone call from the assistant in the Justice Department and told him to stop those investigations. And he was fired on the spot. And he had a press conference that he was fired by the Justice Department in Washington for investigating the murders in California, the murders and riots, and in California. And he said that's the kiss of death to oppose these people. I called Robert Meyer and said, if they are doing these things and concealing it, I've worked on the Robert Kennedy case, would you help me? And of course he said, I'm going to private law practice, and I'm not interested. Later he revealed that the phone call he got from the Justice Department came from L. Patrick Gray, who then later became acting head of the FBI during Watergate. But after he gave the statement that to oppose John Mitchell and L. Patrick Gray back there was the kiss of death, he also was found dead right after that within a short time. I have the dates, in a parking lot in Pasadena. So Robert Crown didn't live to continue his investigation of the police state in Los Angeles, and U.S. Robert Meyer never lived to investigate the Isla Vista riots and the killings of the Chicano moratorium down there and the Chicanos. And the beat goes on. And Evelle Younger, and this is about Evelle Younger, who had direct links to the White House, to the Pentagon, and the FBI. He is a general in the military. He has direct links to the Central Intelligence Agency and was and is working constantly with the FBI. He is the ultimate law enforcement man because of his links to the defense, the intelligence, and the police state network. The man that is running the campaign for Evelle Younger, the funding of his campaign, is a man that Ken Reitz, R-E-I-T-Z, whose name should have made much more attention at the height of Watergate. You can find his name in the Washington Post, an article by Douglas Watson, June the 7th, 1973. Ken Reitz is putting up the money, as I say, running the campaign for Evelle Younger right now. This is what the Washington Post says, that Reitz was a former partner in the campaign consultant firm of Allison and Trey Levin, and he worked for Congressman William O. Mills, who died in Maryland just at the time that his illegal money was exposed, linked to the Watergate White House money. Ken Reitz managed Mills' campaign in 1971, and that he delivered $25,000 in an envelope to James Webster, who was managing Mills' campaign. Shortly after that, Mr. Webster was killed in an automobile crash, and another man who received that money was killed in an automobile crash. And Congressman Mills, when the story came out about his links to Watergate, he died, and they said that he shot himself. It was a suicide at the time of Watergate, described as self-inflicted wounds such as George de Mohrenschildt. Ken Reitz lives, but as I say, his campaign manager is dead. The two men who got the cash are dead, and in the Washington Post, they had an editorial that said, nevertheless, there is no getting around the fact that secrecy and cold cash, two elements running through the current national scandals, were involved in the Mills affair. The contribution to the Mills campaign was arranged by John Mitchell in the first incidents during the Nixon campaign funds, and Congressman Mills then, shortly after this came out, was found dead, and the two men who received this $25,000 are dead. But the man who gave them that money from the White House, from the secret intelligence money, was Ken Reitz, who's now funding the election campaign of Evelle Younger. The importance of all of this is that in the state of Maryland, a lot of money was transacted and not accounted for, and the recipients, 3 known people, are dead. Yet at the time of Watergate, it turned out that there was a lot of money, more than this $25,000, a lot of thousands of dollars. I have the exact figure in one of the other files, to defeat Governor Wallace in his election. Now, Richard Nixon had told Governor Wallace not to run against him, but he wanted to run anyway against him. On the eve of his primary in Maryland and Michigan, George Wallace was shot, and he was shot in Laurel, Maryland, and it's in Maryland that the unaccountable money is. Yet we know that Artie Bremer was up in Canada. He took airplane flights around the country. He stayed at an expensive hotel in Maryland. Like James Earl Ray, he had unaccountable money, important money. So what you see in the comparison to Nazi Germany that I began in the start of this tape is that men that are investigating, like U.S. Attorney Robert Meyer and Robert Crown, are dead. Recipients of the money, such as the Maryland money, are dead. Ken Reitz never gets the exposure. Evelle Younger should never have been allowed to be anything more than the district attorney in Los Angeles. After he covered the Robert Kennedy assassination investigation, he should never move up to being the governor of this state, and certainly he should not have been the attorney general. Louis Tackwood talked about the exposure of these men at the criminal conspiracy section, and we'll go do more about that on the other side of this tape. The criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department is that dangerous network that is linked to the Gestapo, the intelligence community of the Pentagon that has caused so much bloodshed and crime throughout the state of California and is linked to the criminal intelligence throughout the state of California. If I had a staff of workers and a computer, or 8 or 10 people just cross-filing the articles that I have, it would really be a real revealing saga of the era. But unfortunately, I'm doing this alone. And so as I come to all of these various deaths that can hardly be coincidence, I think you can see why I make the strong statements that I do about such people as Evelle Younger. On the next side of this tape, I'm going to talk about the Glasshouse tapes, the book by Louis Tackwood, and the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department as formed by Evelle Younger. Good evening. This is Mae Brussell, scratching up the phonograph. It's Carmel, California, and this is tape number 354. This is side 2, and it's September the 15th, 1978. The New York Times, Monday, October 25th, 1971, carried an important article in quotes, "Informer says that the police prompt radical acts." A long-time informer for the Los Angeles Police Department spun an intriguing web last week of domestic espionage against radical politics. 28-year-old Louis E. Tackwood, a confessed con man, he had been a con man and so forth, helped plan criminal conspiracies and then allowed them to proceed where they endangered innocent victims. Just so the conspirators will be caught in the act. They wanted to make them appear guilty. The police knew in advance that certain black militants wanted to go up to Marin County Courthouse in August 1970 and possibly help some hostages escape. Therefore, they sent up policemen and weapons, and Judge Healy was murdered, and they could arrest Angela Davis and blame them for violence, which they probably had not intended to take place. Louis Tackwood became disillusioned with the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department, which he referred to as a Gestapo, and insists in quotes, they believe in the total power of police over the people. He said there should be a congressional investigation that would evaluate his impartiality and what he was saying. In recent years, he went into political intrigue for the criminal conspiracy section. He was a contact between policemen and Ron Karenga, also later with Donald DeFreeze. He worked with Donald DeFreeze, and he was financed to break up the Black Panther Party and the Black Movement. He charged that the police allowed narcotics to be sold in Black and Chicano parts of town to create dependence on the drug and to undercut thereby the political movement. He charged the police were discussing a plan to foment disturbances at the Republican National Convention in San Diego that would take place next year in 1972, and that the president would have a good excuse for a campaign. He would round up all the known militants in the country. And he was knowledgeable, Louis Tackwood, of the shootout at Marin County and the activity of the police department in Santa Cruz. Now, this is a New York Times story about Louis Tackwood asking for help. What happened was that Louis Tackwood then came out with a book called The Glasshouse Tapes. If you don't have it, get it. It's put out by Avon Press, 1973. If it's not still in publication, you can write to book collectors and get that book. Because he claims that Evelle Younger, Army general, FBI man, CIA man, set up the criminal conspiracy section that went about then planning these various violences of which that he knew about in California. And he exposed Evelle Younger for setting up the criminal conspiracy section. Now, I absolutely believe, based upon every article I have on the subject, and I'm sure there's even more that we could collect, as I say, if I had the money and the labor and the assistance of people to do it, I want to make it very clear on this tape that I believe that the criminal conspiracy section, headed by Evelle Younger, who wants to be our governor, who's the Attorney General now, set up the Manson family with their tentacles and links to the military intelligence, and someday I'll do a tape just on the Manson family. They set up the SLA with Donald DeFreeze, an agent of a criminal conspiracy section, who met with military people to foment what would later be called a terrorist era of violence that would give Evelle Younger the muscle to have political clout and become the governor and maybe a justice on the Supreme Court or the head of FBI, what he wants to be. I believe that the criminal conspiracy section under Evelle Younger, both with Peter Pitches in Los Angeles and Younger as a district attorney and then as the Attorney General, set up, as I say, the SLA and the Manson family. I think they were behind the mass murders in California through the use of mind control and psychiatrists of Edmund Kemper. He was a natural because he'd killed his mother and father when he was little, but then they let him out to spread a scene of terror in the Santa Cruz area, which Kemper claims that persons in the military knew, and one particular watched him carry bodies in. The John Frazier case in Santa Cruz was to come down on hippies and blame them with tarot cards and so forth at the Santa Cruz, in the area of the liberal campus that had just been formed, where Dr. Oda and his wife and sons and secretary were murdered. I correspond with John Frazier, incidentally. He's up at Folsom, and we correspond. The Herbert Mullen series of massacres was identical to the Frazier-Kemper case, the Isla Vista riots, the San Quentin riots, the zebra killings that preceded the kidnapping of Patty Hearst in the San Francisco area, the Los Angeles stranglers linked to the Los Angeles Police Department, the Juan Corona murders, and I could go on with, there were the Bowery bums, the alcoholic, the old men down in Los Angeles. I forget what title they gave them. I'll have to look under my classification of massacres. There has been a series of blood in this state, but it's worse than just using these particular people and setting them up and achieving the terror. What it did was it brought in the LEAA and the various organizations, the police states linked to Washington, and the highest levels of the espionage establishment by a series of murders. Evelle Younger could form all the transactions he needed. Sonny Barger was another one, working with Washington agents from alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, bringing in the Hells Angels to plow over the peace people up in the Bay Area and create a killing of the Altamont concert that a movie was made with the Rolling Stones, making the hippies appear violent and ending the image of the love generation. The California violences have been directly linked to all of these offices. It is just a mess. If you took one by one, which I could do, one each week for 52 weeks, you'd see what I mean. A specific thing that Louis Tackwood wrote about, and I have other articles about, and it is a resume in Glasshouse tapes, a part of it, is the bugging of a psychiatrist. The Bay Guardian had an article on that in the summer of '72. There was a psychiatrist at Soledad Prison named Dr. Frank Rundle at the time of the violence and killings going on there, and a guard had been killed. And Rundle was somewhat sympathetic. He was seeing certain black radicals there as patients. And Evelle Younger wanted these people charged for murdering the guards, and he didn't want Rundle nosing around as a psychiatrist or having any sympathies towards what was transacting. So after a murder in 1971 by a Soledad guard that they wanted to pin on Hugo Pinell, who I later became very close to and correspond with, Rundle was bugged. He wasn't bugged. A man named Tony Pewitt was bugged to try and frame this Rundle to get him out of the prison system because they wanted to put the rap on Hugo Pinell and other prisoners. So Tony Pewitt, an inmate who had worked in Rundle's office, was approached by correctional officials, and he said his parole was coming up, and if he would frame Dr. Rundle for conspiracy involving the prison guards, that he would get his parole. And this came directly out of the office of the Attorney General, Evelle Younger, to frame a psychiatrist who was working at Soledad Prison. So Tony Pewitt was sent out to get the false testimony and frame Rundle. And what they did is they wired him for sound, and I have a photograph of the equipment that they put on him, and they sent him to Pewitt, to Rundle's home, and the men stayed outside. He had a miniature radio transmitter that was put on him, and it was monitored by attorneys, by officials of the Attorney General Younger's office, and they stayed in a nearby car, and they told Pewitt to get evidence to try to link Rundle with the Communist Party or with radicals or with the killings at Soledad, that they should frame him, and then Pewitt would get parole. Well, what Pewitt did was he knew that the car outside with the agents of Attorney General Evelle Younger was outside in the car, and he knew that the house, that he was bugged from inside the house close by. So as he was visiting with Dr. Rundle, who he happened to like and had worked with, he wrote a note while they were talking, coming in, "Hello, how are you? I'm fine, how are you?" And he took a piece of paper and a pencil, and he wrote a note to Rundle, "I'm being wired for sound, I'm bugged, we can't talk. Let's get a way to get out of the house where the car can't follow us and pick up what we're saying." So under the flimsy excuse of, "Do you have Pepsi-Cola or 7-Up," something like that, and Rundle said no, he said, "Let's go in the car and get it," so that the suggestion came from Rundle and not Pewitt that he wanted to leave the house and get some beverage. So Pewitt went along with him and then told him what was happening, and Rundle got to the telephone and called the press and got some people to come to the house, and then Pewitt took off his shirt and showed his clothing and how he was wired and linked it to the Attorney General's office in California, Evelle Younger's office. The result was that Tony Pewitt was released from jail. Of course, it was a conditional parole, but the scandal was so great, and Dr. Rundle was going to sue the Attorney General and the state, but I guess he wanted to live. He was, in quotes, a little smarter maybe than Robert Meyer or some of these other people that were snooping around, but he went on to work in New York City, I believe, in a prison, and he left the state of California, and he never did sue Evelle Younger. But that is the kind of thing that was transpiring here in the California prison system, with Evelle Younger, again, to blame radicals and to discredit a doctor. Now, Louis Tackwood not only talked about the Gestapo, as I say, but James McCord confirmed at the time of Watergate that he was, in fact, afraid of the Gestapo that Louis Tackwood was talking about. And here are men worlds apart, one a white Christian working for the CIA and the military 20 years, and one a black man from New Orleans who had been in and out with the law and is a very bright man, who had warned us that in 1971 there was a man in the White House named Mr. Martin and another man named Mr. White, and that these were his contacts for this secret government inside of a government different than the FBI and CIA that were the Gestapo. And when James McCord was arrested at the time of the Watergate in June of 72, he signed in the jail as Mr. Martin, and the code name, one of the code names for E. Howard Hunt, was Mr. White. And those men were, in fact, those Watergate men were, in fact, working with Evelle Younger's criminal conspiracy section with plans to kill Richard Nixon at the National Convention in 1972 and to make Spiro Agnew the President of the United States. That's Evelle Younger's office, the criminal conspiracy section, working with Louis Tackwood and people inside the White House at the Watergate, and yet Evelle Younger's name was carefully separated from Watergate, and Louis Tackwood was never allowed to call before the Senate Select Committee on Watergate. In fact, in 1973, in the summer, after hearing the testimony on television, I wrote the article for the Realist. The Senate Select Committee is part of the cover-up, and not calling Louis Tackwood, who had foreknowledge of this team and spoke about it in 1971, showed that the courts in Washington, D.C., on wide television intended to lie to the American people, because if they wanted to know the roots of Watergate, they could have gotten into the tentacles of the Los Angeles Police Department and the allegations of the plans to kill Richard Nixon in San Diego. As a matter of fact, those plans were confirmed by the secret army organization, the Minutemen, working with the FBI. There isn't a thing that Louis Tackwood said out of all of his allegations in 1971 that can be disproven right to this day. But there is absolute proof that the courts are as corrupt as the courts in Nazi Germany, that they will now never allow evidence of guilt of this secret team, not until our Gestapo is fully in place, and then, of course, all the records will be destroyed. If you don't have my article, The SLA is the CIA, you can write to me those articles. I charge $1 now for my time, and because there's so few of them left, they are rare. It's $1, and the postage is 40 cents. And in there, all through those references, I go into the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department and Evelle Younger and Donald DeFreeze. And because time is valuable for people who already have that material, I won't duplicate those connections, because those of you that are serious enough to get these tapes should have that article, and you should have my article, The Senate Select Committee is Part of the Cover-Up, and go into Louis Tackwood allegations also. You can order those directly from me. The whole thrust of the SLA is the CIA article was the fact that after America's first, in quotes, political kidnapping of a sort, it would bring on the excuse for, again, more law enforcement, more police. And, of course, I have a press article here. It's in 1964, saying, Younger charges the terrorists are planning an era of violence. In a campaign publicity move motivated to cause nationwide paranoia and unjustified fear of political disorders, California Attorney General Younger in 1974 is hysterically charging that the left wing are terrorists, and that they will upset the anniversary of America, their 200th anniversary, with an era of super violence. That was the 1976 anniversary. This article goes on to say Younger is a major proponent of the death penalty. He's the enemy of black and progressive people, and he is shrill and hysterical, screaming. And along with him at that time was the U.S. Attorney General, William Saxby, calling for a national police force because of so many terrorists in the United States. That's why the SLA had to be created, and all these murders created to blame the hippies and the terrorists. Saul Alinsky, the labor leader from Chicago and labor organizer for housing in the Chicago area, had a home here in Carmel Valley in the Highlands. His widow, Jean Alinsky, is a close personal friend of mine. And Saul Alinsky, at the time of his death, was helping Cesar Chavez with his strike against the farm growers out here in the Salinas Valley. Saul Alinsky was walking down the street in Carmel and one day just dropped over dead. And that's how I met Jean at the time, because I had talked on my radio program about these various people that have been falling down dead very quickly at moments, whether in organizing, like helping Cesar Chavez, and of course Evelle Younger, as a law enforcement official in this state, covered up the expose of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms to kill Cesar Chavez, which was exposed by an agent, Larry Shears, and they were going to use Sonny Barger and the Hells Angels to help them with that job. I have a tape recording of a press conference and the original press conference of the allegations that the White House, a Treasury Department, and that at the time, of course, had Mr. Caulfield and Egil Crow and G. Gordon Liddy and the Watergate team inside the Treasury Department, and they were planning the murder of Cesar Chavez, but that was halted because of Larry Shears. Well, at the home of the Alinskys, some material was taken. Saul Alinsky's keys were stolen, and then they opened up his offices in Chicago with those keys, and there were two men that were recognized for having done the burglary and came forward in 1976. One of the burglars was Jerome Ducote, D-U-C-O-T-E, and he told how he had done work for the CIA and for the Young Republicans, and that he had done dirty work and burglaries on separate occasions, both in the home of Saul Alinsky and burglarizing the United Farm Workers and taking stolen material from that group. He worked on behalf of the farm workers who were directly linked to Mr. Agrario and the Central Intelligence Agency, the lettuce growers. Mr. Ducote was charged with 15 grand theft counts coming from allegedly from welching on loans, but when he came forward and told that he worked for the government and was doing these burglaries for the government, it seemed that most of the charges were dropped, and we never heard much about Jerry Ducote and the burglaries that he did from the farm workers and in Gene Alinsky's home. But another man named Henry Sherling that worked with him, the second man arrested in San Jose for political espionage, claimed that the FBI was responsible for his activities. This was in February of 1976. Henry Sherling, in quotes, told a Justice Department investigator that he committed 16 break-ins during the 60s in the company of self-confessed political burglar Jerry Ducote, and that they took place in the offices of anti-war people, in Ramparts magazine, with the farm labor organizers, and that he understood that they were going to the FBI. Things that he stole, he was under the impression, along with Ducote, were work for the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Now, this same Sherling that said that he was working for the FBI and involved with Mr. Ducote in these burglaries also said that his case was dropped because it would affect the election campaigns of Evelle Younger, that in order to save Evelle Younger on this particular matter of these California CIA links to Cesar, Chavez, and Saul Alinsky and others, that he had to protect the Attorney General of California, Evelle Younger, and therefore the charges were also dropped. Again, like Nazi Germany, the guilty get off and they're out on the streets. Certain patsies are set up like Donald DeFreeze and Charles Manson and so forth. And Evelle Younger continues up the political scale to the heights of wanting now to be the governor of California. So much to tell about Evelle Younger on tape. In the remaining time, I'll just give you a few of the headlines of articles I have about him. One, Younger faults the disclosure laws. This is in February of 1974. He didn't think that California should have to give up the information about where the money comes to men that run in the campaigns. In 1978, in May of 1978, Evelle Younger is asking for 50 new nuclear reactors to be built in California, and he represents the officials in the State Energy Commission and wants to develop this with Edward Teller, the physicist, even though they don't know what to do with the nuclear waste, and there is cancer everywhere around. These nuclear plants have been built, and he's pushing for California to have 50 nuclear reactors. Evelle Younger, 1977, pleading for political executions. I call these political executions because very often on death row, he mentions 53 inmates that the decision could be overturned, and many of these are political murders, blacks, whites, and so forth, and I don't think that we should have the death penalty as long as we have the Attorney General or the government into the espionage kill plan, because in Nazi Germany, one way that they could put Hitler in and affect the law courts is to say, in quotes, a person was escaping, such as George Jackson. And George Jackson was as important a political leader for the young people as Martin Luther King or Malcolm X was for other blacks. And by the excuse that he was fleeing or trying to escape, they murdered him. And Evelle Younger wants the death plea for executions. And he would kill people, charging them with killing prison guards, where he actually, through criminal conspiracy section, brought in people like Louis Tackwood into Soledad prison disguised as a prisoner to create violence in the prison system. Another article here, file shredding case, not a big problem, Younger says. This was in February of 78. The Los Angeles Police Department was charged with these murders and violence against the people in that city, and instead of being sued for that, they destroyed all the police files, and he said that these 4 tons of records that were destroyed were unsubstantiated charges against the policeman, and the charges from 1949 to 1975, the whole era of counterintelligence of the military taking over the police department in Los Angeles after the CIA was formed in 1947, moving the FBI and the CIA into the police departments. All of their mischief was swept away with one fell swoop. It was shredded, and Evelle Younger says, in quotes, shredding the police records isn't that much of a problem. A Chief Deputy State Attorney General Charles Bryan had charged that Evelle Younger, when he was the District Attorney of Los Angeles, ordered a murder confession destroyed as a favor to a defense lawyer who had contributed to his political campaign. He says that the information had to do with a murder case in Los Angeles and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office, and they were going to present a key evidence in this particular case, but that Evelle Younger had suppressed this information for a particular client. And it goes on to say that the prosecution withheld this evidence and that it was one of the toughest black prosecutors they knew. And right after that trial, Burnett, the black deputy district attorney, again, like all the others, died from a reported heart failure. He was a young black prosecuting a case. The Evelle Younger had pressured him not to do it, and right after that, he had died. This case involved the defense attorney, incidentally, Joseph Ball, who was a member of Evelle Younger's club and funded Evelle Younger. And Joseph Ball is also in the law firm, as I said on the other side of this tape, with the father of the governor of California, so that this police state Gestapo infests both parties and is insidious. And this was an allegation made by Chief Deputy State Attorney General Charles O'Brien. He was a very fine attorney in San Francisco. He's still alive, I believe, named Mr. Caldwell, who was representing Hugo Pinnell at the time that Dr. Tony Randall was being framed and was a psychiatrist for the black prisoners at Soledad. And the violence was so bad in the California prisons, thanks to Raymond Prucunier and Evelle Younger and that gang, that they had congressional hearings about the California prison murders. And Mr. Caldwell, the attorney for Hugo Pinnell, went to Washington, D.C., and Mr. Fish was the man who was questioning him. And I have this from the government printing office, the hearings, and Earl Caldwell was talking about Hugo Pinnell, and he said there was a proposal made to the judge in Marin County, but he was powerless to do anything, to handle anything through the Department of Corrections. You see, we have this continual problem. Even the court orders in Salinas are violated by the Department of Corrections. They claim they are independent from the district attorney or any district attorney or any request by the Superior Court. They operate independently, and they have their own counsel, and they are represented by the Attorney General's office. So even a court order of expression of a request of a Superior Court judge cannot be complied with. If they don't want to, they don't comply with it. They said, do you think your client, Hugo Pinnell, is in danger of further assault? I absolutely believe that. Do you think he's in danger of his life? I believe that too. I believe that to be a fact, that the Attorney General's office is a court of its own unto itself, and the Department of Corrections, and they do not go along with the lawyers or the courts. They function privately alone. That is the congressional testimony of Mr. Caldwell, who is trying to expose the criminal conspiracy section in California that Evelle Younger was heading and still heads. Evelle Younger, headlines. This was in March 28, 1971. Younger reports on the state probe that there was no Chavez death plot. Now, this was the Larry Shears allegations, and it said there's no such conspiracy. California Attorney General Evelle Younger said today they investigated Larry Shears' charges, and I don't think that there was a plan to kill Cesar Chavez. And he cleared all these allegations that Larry Shears had made. Evelle Younger said they will not probe it and they will not prosecute anybody. And at that time, a Mr. Jerry Cohn, who represented Cesar Chavez, said, I don't think the government did a good job of protecting Bobby Kennedy or Martin Luther King, and we're not going to rely on them to protect Cesar Chavez. When the evidence came out that the Treasury Department was planning to kill Cesar Chavez, Evelle Younger cleared that up and said there was no plot to kill Chavez. Keep in mind that the Watergate plumbers, as I say, in Washington were working in the offices of the Treasury Department, and Evelle Younger was working directly with them in the Los Angeles Police Department as Attorney General. Not only was U.S. Attorney Robert Meyer fired for investigating the Ruben Salazar death, but October 15, 1970, Los Angeles Times, Evelle Younger plans no charge in Salazar's death. They were not going to prosecute anybody, even though just recently there was a payment to the family of about $50,000 because he was shot by Peter Pitchess and the Sheriff Department. But Evelle Younger, the district attorney, said there would be no criminal charges against the murder of Ruben Salazar, even though he'd gunned down by the police. He worked for the Los Angeles Times. He was a Vietnam veteran and was killed in a cold-blooded manner. Evelle Younger said no charges against that plot. Evelle Younger's sister is a judge on a court in Los Angeles, and Eric Younger, son of State Attorney General Evelle Younger, was appointed to the Los Angeles County Municipal Court as a municipal judge by Ronald Reagan in 1974. So we have a sister of Younger, Mrs. Ziegler, I believe, as a judge in Los Angeles. I never did know if she was related to Ron Ziegler. And we have his son, appointed by Ronald Reagan as a judge, a municipal judge in Los Angeles, California. There's no way to sum up Evelle Younger. I think you can get by the tone of my voice and the amount of material that I've given you a view of Evelle Younger. I will go back next week to the House Select Committee on the assassinations and some of that information. But if you have any questions or want me to do more tapes on Evelle Younger, to continue on the crime of Evelle Younger, because he's a national disgrace, not only a state disgrace. I think we could do more on him because he is one of the most important men, and maybe you should have another tape for your records in case he's nominated to a federal position, which he will be someday. You can transcribe these tapes and send them to the powers that be for the hearings, and maybe they'll be of value that way. I certainly hope we can use this material to stop him, and now it's up to you to take copies of these tapes and send them to officials and get letters to the editor and stop the election of Evelle Younger as the governor of California. That's really important, to hold him, and then the next time he's appointed, pull this information out and go after him with full guns, and don't let him get by the confirmation hearings. The man has allowed the guilty to get off and not be prosecuted, and innocent people to be killed, the courts to be overturned. He's worked with the intelligence community in Washington, the Pentagon. He's the epitome of Heinrich Himmler and Goebbels and Goering, and at least you have the cassette that you can say someday, well, Mae told us so, for whatever it's worth. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be with you next week.